Hello and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. My name is Sarah Small and I'm Food Tank's Chief of Staff. I'm really excited about today's webinar with William Warschauer. He is the CEO of TechnoServe, which is a nonprofit that develops business solutions to poverty. Most of the world's poor depend on agriculture in some way for their incomes, and growth in the agriculture sector has been shown to be at least twice as effective at reducing poverty as growth in other sectors. So today, William will explain some of the business-oriented agriculture initiatives that have led to increased incomes for hundreds of thousands of smallholder farmers around the world. William, we're truly honored to have you here today, and we're also excited to have you as a keynote speaker on the Future of Food panel at our upcoming Chicago Food Tank Summit as well on November 16th. So just a few things before we begin. This webinar will be recorded and posted on foodtank.com afterwards. You can also follow along and participate on Twitter using #FoodTank. And please also submit your questions using your chat box or your control panel. Additionally, you can email them to me, Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, @foodtank.com. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A with William at the end of his presentation. So without further ado, William, as I mentioned, we're thrilled to have you here today, and I'm excited to hear your presentation, so I'll give you the floor now.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to be with everyone. So good morning or afternoon or evening or whatever it is where you are. And I know many of you may be sitting and having lunch, which is doubly appropriate to talk about agriculture then. As you've seen, my topic is reducing poverty through agriculture. And Sarah mentioned, and I think many of you know, about 3/4 of the world's poor live in rural areas. So TechnoServe is an organization dedicated to alleviating poverty, and most of the work we do around the world, therefore, is in the agriculture sector. Again, as you've seen, that growth in the sector is highly effective relative to other interventions at reducing poverty. We have focused since our founding 50 years ago on private sector solutions to alleviating poverty. We focus on connecting smallholder farmers to the information, the capital, and the markets they need to build competitive farms, businesses, and industries. We work with many of the world's leading companies in this endeavor, and as we go into an area or a value chain, we're really rigorous in doing a lot of analysis up front, trying to find a deep understanding of who the customer is, where the demand is, where the market opportunities are, and we're very committed to market-based solutions because we believe those are the ones that will scale and last. So we don't give things away for free. We don't subsidize things. We strive to help the people that we work with get into commercial relationships which truly make sense on commercial terms because those are the ones which we believe can go to scale and can last over time. What you're looking at right now is a fairly simple schematic, but talking about the range of challenges that smallholder farmers across the world face, and they are truly numerous, as many of you know. I won't run through everything you're seeing on this slide, but I did want to call out a handful of things here. I think in the middle there, bridging between the farmer and the market system, this problem around access to agricultural inputs continues to be a major one. As most of you know, you see yields on smallholder farmers in Africa that are often only a fifth what they are in developed markets, and much of that is driven by a lack of use of agricultural inputs. 10 years ago, the Abuja Declaration, African heads of state made a commitment that they were going to raise fertilizer use to 50 kgs per hectare. Now that's only half the current global average, but it was a meaningful increase that they were aiming for. And unfortunately, we haven't gotten there. Currently, the average is only about a fifth of that, only about 10 kg per hectare. and driven by many factors, but certainly high among them is the high cost, particularly in transport, which means that retail fertilizer prices are higher in Africa than in much of the rest of the world, and so just beyond the reach of so many smallholder farmers. I think that the other thing in the middle I would speak to is access to finance. I was in Kenya last week, spending time with some smallholder farmers there, working with a major agricultural input supply company. So this is a company that wants to do business in Africa, that's supplying seeds and key agricultural inputs. And we saw great uptake from farmers who are growing improved varieties of potatoes and tomatoes, who are seeing great yields and great earning from that. And we saw a real problem connecting them to finance, so much so that the ag input company itself was considering either providing or perhaps guaranteeing some finance. So despite all of the good work by the many microfinance institutions around the world, this remains a very live issue. The regulatory environment links to farm size and certainly land tenure and land rights, major issue across emerging markets, which is hard to stress too much. Two other things I'd call out to you on this slide, I think, are areas where technology is making and I think is going to make a major difference. One is around education and training. And we know that it's been demonstrated in our work and the work of many other groups that with a good training, farmers can adopt better practices that can substantially raise yields and often quality and therefore prices of what they're growing. The challenge is really to scale up this high quality education and training and deliver it not just to thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, but you really got to reach millions of people with a quality training. And there are some groups that are just doing fantastic work in this space right now. I just spent time with the team at Digital Green, and they have a solution that works on mobile phones, that delivers training content through video, that uses SMS. They're also on radio. This is really beginning to work at scale, having reached over 1 million farmers. It takes a lot of the cost out of the training, which is one of the key challenges that we're also thinking about going forward. This thing at the top here over the farmer saying local markets, what we mean by that is really that many farmers struggle to access a market beyond the most local one from them. And that local market is often much less competitive and much less profitable for the smallholder farmer. Again, I think technology, the spread of course, mobile phones and therefore of mobile money is enabling businesses to connect with farmers in very remote places. We've worked on a project in East Africa with Vodafone where companies are actually able to buy crops and buy milk from smallholder farmers in a way and pay them in real time over the phone in a way that enables farmers to connect beyond their local market and takes out some of the transaction costs there. So I think there are very meaningful problems we see on this slide and some real causes for hope. As we think about this work, we think about it in these two levels, working with farmers and farmer groups on the one hand, and working and thinking about the entire market system. I think you've got to really find holistic approaches to move the needle in a meaningful way. And I think it's not sufficient to deliver great agronomic training to a farmer who still has nowhere to sell her crop at a good price, and nor is it sufficient to get the business interested or have an improved agro-dealer network and all if you don't have farmers who know what to do with those inputs and how to use them appropriately. So we're big believers in working at these levels simultaneously. There is the building of agronomic capacity. What I haven't included in this slide, which may be perhaps the most important thing we can do at the farmer level, is working with them on business skills. And helping them to have the skills to think about and manage their farm like a business. This is a key transformation that we see time and time again with smallholders, and with some good basic training in this respect, they become quite able to evaluate
whether it is a good investment or not for them to invest in an improved seed or in fertilizer or perhaps in irrigation. They can make very sophisticated decisions about whether they want to plant more of their farm in this crop or that crop, in a cash crop or a staple crop. They're making these trade-offs all the time, and to give them some tools and a framework to do that and understand their farm as a business is one of the most important and most lasting changes that we can make with them. At a system level, we're focused in helping to try to improve the overall system, to try to crowd in business investment. And increasingly, with this interconnected world that I referred to earlier, thinking about how we can align the corporate supply chain's need, which is typically for a regular supply of high quality crop, and the farmer's need. They really need a steady market, better inputs, all generating higher incomes for them. So this is broadly how we think about this. What I'm going to do next over the next 20 minutes or so is kind of walk through 3 different stories with you to try to illustrate what I've been talking about. And so I'm going to begin in East Africa. And this is a story about fruit. And I just wondered if I asked all of you to guess, no Googling allowed, how much of the sub-Saharan African crop production is fruit. I wonder what you would say. You might be surprised to know that that represents fully 10% of sub-Saharan African crop production. But the smallholders who grow most of the fruit have struggled to raise their incomes. And we've seen demand on the continent and in East Africa, where the story I'm talking about took place, growing as the middle class grows. But there has been a problem. There's really been a lack of stable value chains, a lack of good processing needed to help the local farmers meet this demand. And so the project that I'm describing, the genesis of it was a desire on the part of Coca-Cola, which not everybody knows is actually the world's largest juice company, as well as the other drinks that they do. Their desire to they were selling a lot of juice in East Africa, but they had to import fruit puree from outside of the continent to do that business. So they had a desire to locally source. At the same time, you had many smallholder farmers growing fruit, and much of that fruit rotting and going to waste without a market. So a real opportunity there. And we began something which came to be known as Project Nurture. It was a partnership between Coca-Cola, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and TechnoServe. And we had some very ambitious targets that we wanted to accomplish with this. We wanted to increase fruit income for smallholders who were growing mango and passion fruit. We wanted to improve women's participation in and benefits from this farming. And we wanted to improve access to credit at the same time. So again, from the farmers level to the systems level, we wanted to build capacity of fruit processors in East Africa and develop new models for the supply chain, which could be adapted in other situations. And so you're seeing some of the numbers that happened after this work went on in Kenya and Uganda. Delighted to say that we were able to reach 54,000 farmers, so tens of thousands of farmers, and to work at different levels of the supply chain. Smallholder farmers who took part in this got specialized training in agricultural techniques, and the project helped them form producer business groups to manage bulk sales and to manage loans. And there was also, in the second phase, the creation of a pilot market service center, which provided improved services to farmers. So all of this is done with a view, as I said earlier, to letting people get into commercial relationships which make sense on a commercial basis. And so having the fruit producers come together into groups, giving them some buying and selling power, having a new actor in the supply chain who could reliably provide services and inputs to the farmers after the project ended. And in this case, of course, you had Coca-Cola as a highly interested off-taker. interested in locally sourcing the fruit. The project also worked with banks to help develop credit mechanisms to meet the special needs of these smallholder horticultural farmers. And I mentioned the work with processors to upgrade their facilities to a point where they could supply to an international, a multinational customer like Coca-Cola at the quality that they needed. You've seen the numbers here. I won't read them all. There are a couple of numbers I didn't put on the slide. There was a work with 16 different food processors and the participation of more than 150 wholesalers and regional exporters. This work took place in Kenya and Uganda. Two of the Kenyan processors ended up as certified to enter the Coca-Cola supply chain, and those processors now provide all of the mango paste used in Minute Maid Minute Maid juice in a half a dozen African countries. So this is the kind of, as Michael Porter calls it, the shared value opportunity, or a win-win opportunity, where Coke has wanted to be a good corporate citizen and has wanted to save cost. Rather than importing all of this fruit puree from outside, buy it locally. So there's a cost savings for them and a benefit for tens of thousands of farmers and their family members. Let me change crops and change continents now. And I'm going to talk about a similar activity that went on in Peru. This was an activity that was supported by the U.S. government, and as many of you are aware, the U.S. government is actively engaged in trying to support crop substitution. This is an area where a lot of people were growing coca, a large illicit trade with a lot of the violence and other problems that came along with that, and a big push to help them move from coca to cocoa. This was implemented in the regions of San Martin, Ucayali, and Huanco, and we worked with smallholder farmers again, with producer organizations again, and the local government. This is different from the story I just told you in the sense that in the previous example, we had the large off-taker who had a giant appetite for the fruit. And here in Peru, that was another part of the equation. There's a small local market for chocolate in Peru, but the total production of the country in global terms is relatively small. So for the major chocolate companies are not really investing and active in Peru. And so there is both the question of how do we help farmers grow more and improve the quality, and how do we help them access markets. And so that was exactly what we focused on in this project. And you can see here a similar sort of project elements. You can see the resulting increase in yield and the meaningful amount of cocoa beans that were sold. Some of this went to the local market, some of this went to specialty producers in Europe, and it is on its own terms. I think it clearly was a successful intervention. We do return on investment calculations when a donor dollar in. So for every dollar that the USAID invested in this activity, how many extra dollars were gained by the farmers that took part? And that number ended up being between 5 and 6, depending on some of the assumptions you make. So for every dollar in, $5 out, in our view, was a good investment. I think I'm going to skip the next slide and go on to the following slide, and moving on to my third story, which focuses on coffee. So just take a look at the slide for a minute and think about how you would answer these two questions in terms of the world's coffee, how much of the world's coffee production is coming from developing countries, and how much how many of the 10 million coffee farmers in the world are smallholders. And as you can see, about 90% is coming from developing countries, and the great majority of the world's coffee farmers are smallholders. these smallholders struggle to achieve the level of productivity and quality they need to be competitive in international markets. And so I'm going to tell a story about a large initiative that TechnoServe worked on for many years, targeting coffee farmers in East Africa. And you can see where that took place. And again, you can see some of the key elements working again at the farmer level and at the market system level. And in coffee, as in some other crops, the starting position is that the smallholder is struggling. They typically have a very small farm size, so they don't have that many trees that they can cultivate. They typically have a very low yield, how many coffee cherries come off their tree, and then they're typically price takers and are subject to the vagaries of the international prices. And often, if their quality is poor, they may actually have to sell it below the world price. Their coffee may not be ultimately sold at the world price. So they've got issues around that. It's quite difficult to help them grow their farm size often, but there's a lot that can be done to help them increase their yield and the quality of the coffee. The ambition of this project was large, and it was supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who provided generous funding to reach a large number of farmers in the region. It helped establish new coffee cooperatives. So as we saw in some of the other examples, the power of farmers working together, sharing skills, improving their buying and their selling position as a business group or cooperative rather than working individually. And this idea of providing farmers with business training so they can think about their farm as a business and make those business decisions, as well as some agronomy and processing work to help them improve the quality of their coffee. You can see the numbers here, more than a 250,000 people benefiting, over a third of them women. The wet mills that are mentioned here is a way to locally process coffee that is the key way to raise the quality of the bean. So these are relatively small machines, relatively inexpensive, that can be run in a remote area with a generator to locally process the coffee at the level of a coffee cooperative. You can see the meaningful number of metric tons of coffee that went through those wet mills, and a meaningful increase in coffee income. I'm trying to be mindful of time. There's a lot that I could say about this. I think that I would mention this idea of cupping labs. Cupping is a very formal way that coffee quality is evaluated. And it's a bit like how they score wines, only in fact much more detailed. And these cupping labs were installed throughout the region so that the cooperatives and the farmers themselves could understand what drove the specialty buyers that came to buy their coffee at this higher price, and could have a conversation in a more equal sort of way with those buyers. Again, with the idea of getting people into commercial relationships which make sense and last on commercial terms. I've talked a lot about the impact lasting, and that's very important to us. I think it's a healthy challenge. There are a few groups working. Plan International is one of them, who are scrupulous about going back years after their interventions end and evaluating whether the impact that went on during a project has persisted over time. The Government Accounting Office here in the United States has called out USAID for not doing enough of this, and USAID, I think, is newly energized to do more of it. We have commissioned an external research agency to go back and find some of these farmers that took part in this project I've just described. This is now ended 5 years ago in Rwanda and Ethiopia, where they went back to do this research. And the report is still in draft form, but we will publish it and put it up on our website. And we've been delighted to see that the many of the changes that I described here have persisted in the 5 years since we stopped working with those farmers. And so the price increases that they gained, the yield increases, and some of the changes to the structural systems in the value chain have persisted 5 years on. Let me try to take this down to a personal level, and just to remind everyone of what all these big numbers sort of look like at the level of a particular village or a particular cooperative. In 2012, this program worked with farmers in the village of Bisheshe and helped them form a cooperative they called the Hunde Oli Cooperative. And the focus, as I mentioned, was really there to build their own wet mill so they could process their own coffee and get a much better price for it. The chairman of that cooperative, Mustafa Abanako, he recalled that it was very hard to get other members to do that. There was not a tradition of cooperatives in that community. But there was a cooperative not far from there, the Duramina Cooperative, that this project had worked with earlier. And that was a cooperative that was having great success. Its members' earnings were sharply up, and whose coffee was being actually recognized around the world as a very high quality coffee. And they had a lot of specialty buyers coming and offering high prices for it. So that Duramina coffee today, you can buy from Stumptown Coffee Roaster if you go on their website and see it. So Mustafa saw how viable that business is, and he persuaded 128 other farmers to join this new cooperative in its first year. And the growth of it has been dynamic. Like the Duramina down the road, they've attracted the specialty coffee buyers. The annual sales of that cooperative have gone from 255,000 up to almost $500,000 a year. There's more than 150 farmers who now sell a coffee cherry to the cooperative. And indeed, last year, the cooperative built a second wet mill to more than double their processing capacity. Like their brothers and sisters down the road, the Hunde Ali Cooperative spends 15% of its profits on social projects in the village. They've added on to the school. They've funded construction of piped water to 400 homes. And so there are tangible benefits at the village level of kids going to school, of people having clean water to drink, that are heartening to all of us who do this work. Let me close by, well, I will just say a couple of words about this slide, and I want to close by talking about some of the challenges we face before I take your questions, which I look forward to. I just wanted to underline that while the topic of this talk is about alleviating poverty, of course, all of us care about food security, and too many of the world's poor are highly food insecure. And malnutrition and stunting is a major problem, as most of you know, around the world's poor. And so it's important to understand this link between cash crops and food security. Some people can misunderstand and feel that it's not right or even not ethical to work with farmers growing coffee or growing cocoa when there are risks that they not have enough food to eat. But what we see is, in fact, that these working with cash crops is a very, very powerful way to help improve food security. And I want to just read a quick quote from Dr. Bart Minton, who's with IFPRI. He has said that one cannot underestimate the role that coffee plays for food security of a large number of smallholder farmers in East Africa. Coffee income is an important source of income of these coffee farmers, especially during the lean period when food security issues are most severe. That income also allows for access to agricultural inputs during the planting period, leading to significant positive spillover effects of coffee for the whole farm and leading to further improvements of these smallholders' food security situation. I think he puts it very well. And so while we have added on agronomic training in all of our coffee work that helps these farmers also with improved practices around their staples, whether that's beans or maize or rice. This idea that there is additional income and that this smallholder who now is able to think about her farm as a business can direct some of that income to improve the yields of the staple crops that she's growing. Because of course in Africa, no one is just a coffee farmer. Everyone is growing multiple crops, typically including several staple crops. And so in that sense, we see a much better availability of the staples through these interactive effects. And I can talk more about that if anyone's interested. Let me show you one more slide, and then I'm going to wrap up and look forward to your questions, I think. I want to talk to the challenges. There we go. I've talked about a lot of wonderful work, and there's a lot of great work going on that other organizations at TechnoServe are engaged in. I think that we know more and more a lot of things that we know work, and then with the rapidly changing technological landscape, there's a lot of exciting new opportunities in remote soil sensing and drones and all sorts of interesting things on the horizon for us. There are some meaningful and persistent challenges, and I could have put a lot of bubbles on the slide, but I thought I would just talk briefly to three of them. One is about scale. And while you saw, even in the largest activity I described with over 250,000 people benefiting directly from the activity, and we can all feel good about large activities that are reaching those kinds of numbers, that is still a small fraction of the estimated 10 million or so coffee farmers in the world. And so I think we are relentlessly thinking about how do we take more of this to scale? How do we take cost out of the training that's such an integral part of this? How much can technology help us in that respect? We are experimenting with drip training through SMS and through video on the phone, and through how much of that is a supplement to human interaction, or how do we decost that? I was having we spent a day talking about this, in fact, in Kenya last week with a major agricultural input supplier who will be a key part of the solution over time, who is eager to sell improved seeds across the continent and crop protection products, and who is looking for the most efficient package to have farmers able to use those. Who will do these activities? What's the role of an international organization like the one I lead versus local organizations versus corporations? The scale is a major challenge, I think. Gender increasingly goes without saying, which I think is a good thing, but there's much work left to be done. And I think we are trying to be especially sensitive to the many unintended consequences that can sometimes arise if you don't take gender into account as you design and execute programs. I could tell several stories about that if anyone is interested, but there's a wealth of data, as most of you know, that show that when women control income and control assets, the family does better than when men control them. And so we and many others in the space are focused on trying to make sure that that women gain that income through these kinds of activities. In many places where we go, in many of the crops we work with, we're told, oh, well, that's a man's crop. And invariably, the only reason that's really said is because there's money involved and it's a profitable crop. It's not that the women are incapable of farming the crop. So there remains a lot of work to be done in this area as well. And then I spoke earlier about it, but I just would underline again the challenge of financing. And whether this is at the smallholder farmer level who may need a few $100s to purchase agricultural inputs, whether this is at the small agricultural processor level who may need $100,000 to grow her processing business, even with the great interest in the flood of impact investors, most of those funds tend to want to only do investments of $1 or $2 million and up. And there are a lot of people and businesses out there that need smaller amounts of capital, which can be game changing for them, and they're really struggling to access it. So let me stop there. I hope that some of that was interesting and clear enough, and let me open up the virtual floor for any questions or comments you may have.
Great, thank you for an informative presentation, William. We do have a lot of questions from our listeners, so for the next 10 minutes or so, let's get through as many as we can. So I'd like to start by asking you a question from our listener, David, and he wants to know, proof of what William is saying comes from Cheeto's Blend in Zimbabwe, where she was able to change not only her life, but her communities too. How can the coffee model be adapted for tilapia farming in Africa?
Well, I'm not familiar with the example that David gives, but I think that the model in general is highly adaptable across different crops and value chains. I think it is the same logic that really needs to be looked at. So starting with a detailed analysis up front of the opportunity of the market system, of thinking about what the small fish farmer in this case needs. We try to really distill the agronomic training down. What are the handful of most high impact things that we can train on? Often, with my apologies to PhD agronomists, there will often be sort of 57 different things that are recommended in an ideal world, and we rarely work in that ideal world. And so thinking about the key package of training that you would deliver, and then thinking about the whole market system, where are the customers for tilapia there, and so on. But yes, I think the general approach translates. We've seen it with dairy, with fruit farmers, with maize farmers, coffee, cocoa, cashew, and so on. So I'd love to learn more about the example you mentioned.
Great, and David, you can add any information or links on that in our chat box as well, so we can follow up. William, our next question comes from a listener, and it reads, how is storytelling also a part of spreading the word about your training and encouraging more farmers or producers to get involved?
Great question. I like it. Yeah, I mean, smallholders are, of course, they're not dumb. They're very smart, and they're often fairly risk averse. I mean, they are living on the edge with very little margin for error and feeding their families through the fruits of their labor. So they are very often, quite appropriately, in my view, in a show me mode. And we do a lot of work with demonstration plots. You can talk until you're blue in the face about how great this improved maize seed is, or how if you just use a little fertilizer, there's dramatic difference. But none of that replaces, I think, showing people what's possible. And often we will do that with a farmer group. If it's someone coming in from outside and farming it, often they may think, well, that's possible for somebody coming in, but not for us. But if it's a farmer group themselves and they're doing a demonstration plot, which is yielding twice what the plot next door is yielding, that's a very powerful thing for them to see. So, so I think there's a lot to showing and not just telling.
Great, thank you, William. And our next question comes from Flo with Sustainable Harvest International, and she wants to know, TechnoServe's focus on business development is an important component of poverty alleviation. As a basis for that, is there enough focus on development on helping millions of hungry farmers to grow crops to feed themselves before growing crops for sale to volatile markets?
Well, look, I want to appreciate and endorse the spirit behind that question. I think we all come to this work for similar reasons, which is poverty alleviation and a sensitivity and often personal experience with people who are quite poor and really challenged and living on the edge. And so there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. I'm aware of your organization, which does great work. There's also the 1 Acre Fund, I'm sure many of you know, that's also doing great work. There's a lot of excellent work in this space with different kinds of approaches. I would just reiterate the point that I made earlier in my talk, that I don't think that a focus on business or even a focus on cash crops is inconsistent with helping very small holder farmers with very small farms who have very few assets and often very little land, substantially change their circumstances. And so cash crops can play a role in that, as I talked perhaps too briefly about earlier, where the extra income from that cash crop can help drive increased production of the food crop. So I appreciate and endorse the spirit of the question, and I think there's a variety of approaches that can help the very real problem you point out of just making sure that families are food secure and have enough to eat and proper nutrition.
Thanks, William. Vanessa from DC asks, what steps do you take to ensure women don't face backlash from the men in their family or their community when they participate in TechnoServe's programs and grow their income?
Oh, it's a great question, Vanessa, and there's so many interesting aspects to this. I think one of the things that we have done that has been, I think we found to be very effective, is that we will often have both the men and the women come together to trainings that we're giving, which tends to diffuse some suspicion that can be present. While it's sometimes frustrating that one has to do this. I was in northern Ghana not too long ago, meeting with a women's group that was processing shea there, and they were a terrific group. They were doing very well. They were very sophisticated. They had fully internalized all the numbers in their business. They had microfinance institutions coming to them, trying to give them loans. They were turning them away. They had done the math and figured they would use their own capital to grow their business. But as I met with them, there was a group of men sitting off to the side, essentially just listening to the meeting so that they knew what was going on. They knew I wasn't creating any suspicion that I was coming in and saying anything. So I think it is, there are various strategies for including men, for making transparent what's going on in a way that can help diffuse some of this. But I think I don't want to be Pollyanna either. I think it's a persistent problem. We've seen that. We've also seen instances where women are being economically productive, and when harvest time comes, the men who may be away selling their labor show up and grab all the cash. And so in those cases, we've had to go back and we've had to work with women to help them open bank accounts and be able to manage some of the revenue that they're earning. So there are many layers to this onion, and we keep trying to peel them back, but it's an important question.
Great, thank you. And just a clarification from Flo as she follows up. She says, didn't mean to say TechnoServe needs to focus on farmers feeding themselves, just wondering if enough other orgs focus on it. And maybe that's a follow-up conversation that your two organizations have as well. The next question reads, how can funding and donor communities be encouraged to get involved, or how can we get their attention?
Well, I suppose it depends on where you are. It's very interesting. We've seen the trend of donor funding being less and less of the money that's coming into emerging markets. Depending on whose numbers you believe, last year, for every dollar of donor funding of ODA money, there was about $6 or $7 of foreign investment. And while Africa has lagged behind, even in Africa, it was either last year or the year before, where there were more investment dollars coming in than there were donor dollars. So obviously there are humanitarian crises and other things where it's got to be donor dollars. But it's interesting to begin to think about where are there business opportunities, often starting with local businesses. Is there a processor who needs supplied with something, as a way to think about how you can begin to do some of these activities which will last over time. And then various donors, of course, have their own sort of processes for applying for funds, and those vary widely from donor to donor.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, how do you see organic versus conventional farming being a part of the poverty solution?
Really interesting question. This is a great group. I love these questions. I wish we had a little more time. I think it's interesting. Organic presents some opportunities because often the crop can command a higher price. So there are sometimes some income opportunities for smallholders there. To be frank with you and everyone on the webinar, some of our farmers are essentially organic by necessity. They struggle to have access to a lot of agricultural inputs, so they probably would like to use a fertilizer or maybe a pesticide if they could, but they don't have access, so they're organic by necessity. So I think it's a balancing act. I think you've got to try to balance the opportunity for better prices that organic can command with, in some cases, the dramatic change in yields or even the ability to save a crop from being wiped out when there are problems, and at least trying to make sure that smallholders have the ability to make that choice.
Yeah, that's great. Our next question I'm interested in the answer to as well, and it reads, as a consumer, how can we make better, more sustainable coffee purchases that might benefit smallholder farmers?
Yeah, another great question. Well, you are not alone in asking this question. More and more consumers in the United States and in developed countries around the world are concerned about this. And the good news is that your concern, your caring about this changes the game and directly benefits the smallholder. We at TechnoServe are very into the idea of value addition. That is, how do we bring extra money into the value chain so that the smallholder can earn more? And your concern about where your coffee comes from is being heard loud and clear by the major coffee roasters. And your willingness to pay for a bean that you know comes from a clean supply chain where there hasn't been child labor or other abusive practices drives these companies. And I can tell you, we work with most of the world's major coffee companies, and they are extremely focused on this. And the reason they are is because they, like any good company, listen to their customers. So your concern is driving substantial investment. And what I didn't mention when I talked about that coffee activity that I described is that in the wake of that activity, with all of these smallholders able to supply better coffee, there's been over $25 million of private investment in and around those farmers by all of these coffee companies to support and expand what the Gates Foundation investments started. So keep asking that question, but I want to be encouraging that the companies are hearing it, they know you care about it, and they're being responsive.
Thanks, William. And unfortunately, we are running low on time. We have a lot more questions, but I think time for just one more. So this question reads, how do you think that agriculture can not only lift people out of poverty, but also change the economic landscape of developing countries?
Well, I don't know how much time we have. It's another excellent question. And I think at the risk of sort of hyper summarizing, I mean, I think that there are a number of ways that happens, that the growth of ag can support and indeed be supported by the growth of other value add businesses like processing. So there are certain knock-on effects. There are then various paths as you think about the economic development of a country. I think that some people will earn a story I didn't get a chance to tell you is about a farmer we worked with whose son has gone on to get a university degree and be an engineer. His family for generations just farmed, but they were able to earn enough to provide a different sort of activity. So there'll be people that move and get out of ag, which is a part of that path. There'll be some consolidation, and there'll be bigger farms and more commercial farms that will go on. But it's not an either or, it's all of the above, and smallholders are going to continue. They certainly grow the majority of the world's food today and will continue to for some time. We need to help them improve their productivity and to be able to earn enough so that they can lift their families out of poverty and lead dignified lives.
Thank you so much, William, and thank you for joining us today and for all your work in lifting individuals out of poverty through agriculture. I apologize to all of our listeners who we weren't able to get to your questions, but you're welcome to follow up with me, Sarah@foodtank.com. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. So again, it's been a pleasure, and thank you again. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.